Hello, my dear friend, and welcome to the Spiritually Engineered Podcast, where we take a deep dive into the human experience from a spiritual perspective. Come on in, and I invite you to stay. One day, I went to my former job where I worked at a private middle school, to participate in Career Day. And this came about through connections with former colleagues and just having connections as a graduate in general that landed me this opportunity, which I'm really grateful to have received the invitation and to have accepted it. And when I showed up, I remember getting all my things together, reconnecting with former colleagues, kind of getting situated, getting my schedule, and just having a window of time to get myself ready. And I ended up talking to the whole school about what I do. And to give you a sense, it's like 94 students total, but they're each in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade. And each grade level was 2 sections of each grade level. So you could look at it as 6 parts or 6 classes. So 2 sections of 6th, 7th, and 8th, so forth. And I had a pretty much like 20 minutes for each session, and I was basically from the start time from like 10 to 12. I was just back to back talking to all the kids. So, and I went through it, and pretty much was able to make it at the end of it feeling still pretty high in terms of my energy level. And I wanted to just use this episode to talk about, that important piece. At least the part where I was focusing on, I know I was like there to share about what I do as far as my day job, and why it's important, why it matters, and to, even to inspire, any future trail rangers that want to do this kind of type of work, and if more people knew about the kind of work that's out there and that's possible, I mean, it could do so much, and that's part of why that was part of my fulfillment in sharing this, so that I'm letting them know, like, hey, there's this job opportunity where you literally get paid to ride a bike, ride a bicycle or an e-bike specifically. So I felt good about that, thinking about it from that perspective, but then also thinking about it, of course, because your boy is all about that learning and growing, looking at it from that sense of my opportunity there. Now, before I get there, I just want to share that day itself was a huge highlight, because, for me, I have a tendency to worry about how things are going to work out when I'm like planning for an event, whether it's like I'm speaking in front of a group, I'm being just involved in some activity or events, whatever the case may be it business or social, I get nervous. I worry about how things will play out. And if it's business related, sometimes I plan, and almost too much to my own detriment, that I start to worry that is it going to go according to plan. But I know from experience the importance of adapting. Think like water, just being able to adapt. And it's amazing how when I step foot into, or at least it's amazing looking back now, whereas initially I was worried about how things were going to work themselves out. Those little, and I'm talking about the little things, right? I mean, obviously I knew that the whole event was going to do its thing, and I trusted it was going to go well. But it's always like those little things that can come up. But it's interesting how things unfolded in such a way where it's like it helped me out a lot, because the schedule got changed, and where I was initially going to speak with just a small portion of the class, ended up talking to, the entire school, and I was going to be in one location, hoping that I was hoping to be in one location, in one room, and in one classroom in the school, so I can showcase my bike. But then that didn't work out because I was in another classroom, and I thought I wasn't able to basically do my thing with my presentation because I wanted to utilize like a show and tell style where I show my tools and equipment and my bicycle. But that actually was able to work itself out. And I was able to have a space in the library where I was able to actually get my bike inside and showcase everything. And I had some help from the staff as well. So there was that beautiful support and backing in this whole opportunity. And it's amazing how when I'm like have my energy set on what I'm doing and I'm moving towards and I'm gonna be involved in something that's in my niche, that's in my purpose, that's in alignment. To me, I look back and I can recognize those moments when I was getting help from my team of spiritual helpers, team from the support from the universe to line things up the way I needed to, you know. I even, like I mentioned, I had that opportunity, that window of time to get myself situated. But when I came up at at the school initially, I was worried about the timing, how things were going to work out. If I had, I want to make sure I was prepped and all the things, and I was able to get that as they were making some changes to the scheduling and how the program was going to go, like all the moving parts. But regardless, through all those changes, it worked out for the better to help me out, to help me feel primed and ready to do my thing and share about my program. I mean, not my program, the program I'm a part of. and and I'm definitely really appreciative. I think there's a lot of power there, and I think when all that to say, when I'm directed and moving towards and doing something that I know it's like there's something there spiritually. There's just never underestimate the power of what our of what your spirit guides can do to help you in a situation. How sometimes just even asking for help. Hey, can I get some help here? If you're doing an event or something, and even if it's just a weird thing, I don't know. I don't know how you feel about it. If you feel like you have presence near you 24/7, like I know I do. But even consider for a moment to just ask for that help, because that help can come in a lot of ways, and it's as real can get. It is real as the voice you're hearing in this podcast talking to you. Or it's as real as if you're in front of a person and they just gifted you something. Like, it's to me, it's to that extent, because just looking at it, just at least hindsight looking back, I mean, even in the moment, I was able to recognize how things were working out. It's not all hindsight. I have my moments when I'm just like, okay, I'm in it, I'm involved, but I can have that awareness. So I share to say not to underestimate that, because you'd be surprised the amount of the backing and support that's out there for us, and why I believe that life's there for us. I give reminders. Just nothing but gratitude is what I have. Now, back to what I wanted to get to with as far as like the learning and growth part. I wanted to spend some time talking about communication, because that was one of the big things. It's like, okay, I'm setting this intention to work on my communication skills. And, initially when I was prepping for all this, I even worked it out with my director the day before to figure out some good bullet points, like an elevator pitch, something that would be appropriate for like a 20-minute session, because that's all I had for each class section. And I was not even here, but I've had other stuff, like even as I can think back as far as like high school and college doing presentations, where I would worry about not saying enough, and that there would be just a space of just silence, and it would feel awkward. In my experience, it's the opposite that happens. I end up talking so much that it's like I go past the time limit. And so for me, remembering that, I knew like, okay, because I was having that worry, like, what if I don't say enough? And I'm like looking at the paper that my director and I drafted together, and then just like tuning in, I knew like it's gonna be keeping it compact, keep it simple, just communicate the important pieces to the program. Because I could go and talk a whole lot. I could talk for an hour. I could talk for much more, or definitely longer than 20 minutes if I were to go over in depth about our program. But I needed to keep it compact, and also I had to be considerate of my audience, which was high school boys, grades 6 to 8. And then so as I was going through the opportunity and just sharing with each section, one thing I've observed and just recognized is the feedback I get from my audience. And, you know, the eighth graders in particular weren't necessarily like, or at least, certain sections of them weren't like super enthusiastic. They were asking some questions, but then I noticed some differences in sixth and seventh grade, and with the amount of questions and engagements I was getting. And so to me, that was very good information for me to take in, but not take personally. I know for me, what can get my communication kind of suppressed, or where I experience blockage, is where my emotions, and I start taking things personal, and I start putting meaning into things that have nothing to do with me. You know, when when I observed the feedback that they gave me, it's like, okay, I'm not, I had to make those small adjustments and maybe even like changed up the tone a little bit to be able to engage with them. But with this particular time, with at least with the students, with the class sections that weren't being enthusiastic as much or weren't as engaged, I did the best I could. And one of the things I've noticed when I compare each of the sessions, as I was going through in my mind, this is one of those reminders that I told myself, is that, when it comes to life, it's all about practice. Communication is a lifelong practice. I don't care who you are, if you're the president, if you're the pastor, if you whomever, I don't care who you are. You are always practicing. In my opinion, we are all always practicing. I am always practicing. That's part of the human experience here in this school, the way I see it. And I share that because with the idea, when I say that it's practice, there's this acknowledgement at some point I might screw up. I might make something unintentional may happen, whether as me from the communicator standpoint, or the other receiver standpoint, which is outside of my control, right? And it's so dynamic that there's bound to be some kind of either disagreement or some kind of tension, or something will happen where the communication just like, the way it gets relayed. But like I said, it's an important practice. So as I was going through all the classes, and I only had like maybe a minute of break before the next student that came in. But to me, I saw this all as a challenge. I noticed how with certain classes, I would talk about certain things, and there were some things that was pretty much consistent in terms of my content, what I was sharing, especially like giving my context background as a former student, as a former employee of the school. And then I kind of changed it up when I would talk about the program. And I say that to say with acceptance and no big deal. I feel like with certain sections, I was, when I communicate, I really try to do it in that place of just like intuitively. And sometimes I'll focus on something, or this is where my guides will come in. They'll share something with me, like they'll just slip it in there real quick, like, oh, I can talk about that. Like where I can do a show and tell of the equipment, where I show and explain some of the tools that we use. There were some classes where I brought my DC map, where I could show them to give them a visual of where we work geographically. And there was some I gave some questions as I was presenting, and that was a cool thing too that I've learned and kind of grown in this in this particular opportunity, because as I know initially I would give my presentation and then have the Q&A, but then that morning progressed, going through the classes, some of the classes started asking me questions along the way, right? Which is natural. Like if you've ever been the listener of somebody presenting, right? I'm sure this is something that you can relate to. And initially I would say, okay, now hold on for a second. I'll hold off on the question. But then at some point I decided, you know what, let me answer that question. Because then what I did was I would answer that question, and then I would use it to kind of guide the conversation a bit in a certain direction. Especially because if I'm getting feedback on, like if they're asking about my bicycle or they're asking about me personally, that I think I've learned, to me, it's like those are good ways to pivot so that I can really increase more engagement with my audience. So if I'm already starting to get questions Like that in of itself is already engagement. That's a good thing. Now it's like, okay, I got that data, so to speak. Now let me use that to go a certain direction. And so it's pretty cool, as I was going through the presentation, answer the questions that came up, that popped up, I was able to keep myself on track with the flow I was trying to move into the presentation with. Again, I'm seeing all this as energy and like going down a path, taking them all down, a journey, if you will. In some sense, it's almost like storytelling. The way I was approaching that, the as I was sharing about a program. Again, I was up here talking about career day presentation, and I was talking about storytelling. Yeah, I believe like using those kind of skills to be able to relay that message to people can really help inspire, and even inspire people to like take action in a way. Like those are really, I think, essential soft skills no matter who you are and where you are. This is like relating 101. So that was something that one of the things that I took from that, and why I was very appreciative of this opportunity, because especially when it comes to presenting in front of a crowd, something I feel like I know it's in my niche, that's in part of my life purpose and my direction and what I need to do and how I can be of service to people. That was one of the reasons why I'm grateful that this manifested. And it's funny enough when I look back, this is part of like, in a sense, spiritually, I manifested this because last year I was thinking about, for 2026, this year, that I really want to start stepping out of the comfort zone and really putting myself in a situation where I feel like, although uncomfortable, yet there's a part of me that feels that there's fulfillment there. I can feel it, and I can feel it, and I felt it in the past. So I'm always like just looking at things like that from that the bird's eye point of view, even when I'm in the midst of stuff. But at times, for me, I have to remind myself when I'm experiencing things, the good and the bad, particularly the bad, I gotta work through it as best I can and not try to like be so stoic, if you will, or try to be like, oh, let me take a step back. Sometimes I just have to work through with the stuff. In fact, I would say often that would have to be the case for myself, and I would assume the same for other people, right? When it comes to like looking back, hindsight, and all that stuff, there's a reason why that it's like if you're going through a storm, don't try to like make sense of the storm while you're in the storm. Wait till it subsides, then go back up, and just evaluate, regroup. What was that about? That's something that I'm laughing because I've had experiences where I've just done the opposite. Like I said, I'm just trying to figure it out. Like, oh, and I get so frustrated. I'm like all this type of stuff, and I'm like, process. I've been processed. Just go through it, work through it, trust, work through it. So, and I feel a lot, and now I feel more empowered after doing that experience. And for me, it's wanted to look towards more opportunities. So, all that to say, whatever your intentions are for this year, I don't know if you set New Year's resolutions. Maybe that turns you off. I don't know if you work with goals. I mean, because I look at them one and the same. Resolutions, goals is just resolutions as the beginning of the year type of thing. But I'm always making goals month to month. I set goals daily. I set my energy. I set them dynamically. And it's like I'm getting at a place where I'm getting better at working with my goals. And especially, I think it's important when it comes to working with goals, is to do it in a way that it's fun. Because if it's not fun, then what's the point of pursuing a goal? If there's no fulfillment and fun in it, well, then what the hell? You know? So I want to take it back. When it comes to communication, the the key I want to emphasize again is that it's always a practice. And you know, something that I do, I would try to remind myself. Something I would suggest to you is to put a sticky note somewhere where you go to, like maybe in the mirror in your bathroom or something, because I can't tell you how many times I communicate something and I start feeling some type of way or feeling down or angry at myself for saying something that, I don't know, is just being a part of the human experience here. Like, it's always about the communication. I mean, it sounds like such a cliche, but it's a staple to relating, and I would even say it's a staple to beingness. Let me expand on that. So I just gave an experience where I was talking about the communication in a traditional way, the just in a traditional understanding, or like, I guess, or the common understanding, communication, words, talking, right? Okay, that's one form of communication, but that's not the only form of communication. And if, and I'm sure you probably recognize this, there's also the non-verbal way of communication. There's body language, right? I'm sure you've heard that before. Maybe not. I don't know. I can't assume. And that's another thing I've learned too when it comes to communication, not to assume. Because if there's assumption involved, communication will not, the necessary communication that needs to be relayed won't be relayed. And then situations can come up. So I would definitely say on that, be careful with assumption. Because if you assume, there's going to be troubles and then all of a sudden issues can come up in relationship dynamics. So for me, I'm always trying to make sure that I always am clear about this. I did never want to assume. So back to nonverbal. Something I've learned in my journey is that communication is always happening. Like your communication system, your outer and your inner, is always being expressed, if you will. Like you could say, like signals are always being sent out. So the outer being the nonverbal, like the body language, right? What we can see on the surface level stuff, and then of course the words. Inner communication system is basically our psychic abilities. If someone tells you psychic abilities, I have psychic abilities, whatever, it's not, psychic abilities is not something that we have, it's something that we are. That's something I definitely learned from a good friend of mine who was featured on the podcast, shared about this. Like, you don't have psychic abilities, you are a psychic being. So with our communication system, it's part of our own expression, and to give you some perspective, you've ever met someone who's like, or seen someone that just walks into a room and somehow seems to command presence? You ever found someone who says very little, yet you can kind of get a sense of how this person is, despite the fact that they've said very little? Maybe you might know somebody who's a few words, but really you can feel their presence. It's very something about it is very distinct. I definitely come across some people that, their presence really speaks to me. I catch them like, oh, okay. Some where I felt something, it stimulates some insecurity within me. With others, it stimulates some security in me. And that isn't to judge it. This isn't to judge it, but it's just an awareness for the way I see it. And so your presence speaks. You could just walk into a bar and just do your thing, and maybe perhaps you're there, um, and the bartender comes to you. It's like, hey, how's it going? What would you like to drink or something? Or maybe they might, if it might inspire somebody to be like, oh, you like you're having a good time or enjoying yourself or whatever, or or like, and they may offer you a free drink on the house out of nowhere, you know. Like, I'm just thinking one one example, right? But I know for me, I've definitely had a couple experiences, some experiences where it's just like I speak less and it's more about just my presence, you know. And of course, there's also actions that can speak as well, actions that communicate as well too. So communication is so dynamic from both, just again, from the receiver point of view and from the sender point of view. And that's what I'm going to say. Communication is practice, and there's always something to learn. There's always something to unfold. And so going back to when I mentioned like the energy aspect of our communication and with the presence, even like I think that's where our emotions can be expressed, where sometimes the people who are very perceptive can sense when someone feels off. They feel like worried, afraid, or angry. Even though some people are pretty good at masking on the surface. But no matter who, even if you are good at masking from the surface, a good intuitive, someone who's very in tuned, can spot someone and be like, oh, something's off about that person. You know, again, it's like that communication, like where one the outer communication might be, you could say, muted or something, but the inner communication can still be heard, can still be felt, can be sensed, can be known. And I believe that, for me, something that I work on as well too, where I have to trust. In some sense, we have that sense to discern if someone's like deceiving us or not, because we have that awareness, that oneness, and the open communication, just like who we are as a soul. We pick up and send energy, right? Think like a radio tuner. We can tune into things. And even like when it comes to like our interactions with the universe, because I've always believed the universe has a way of reflecting what we put out, and what we put out can also be in the form of our presence, and even by how we feel. How do you feel? Because then the universe can just reflect that or even amplify that. And so for me, I've learned that it's important that I check on how I feel, especially because sometimes how I'm feeling, it's not even me. It's something else. It's someone else. I'm sure you've where you had a day where you felt pretty good, and all of a sudden you came across a person, and all of a sudden, like after that interaction, you felt kind of down now. That's like energy 101 right there. The exchange of energy. And I think that kind of distills it even further if we're talking communication in this episode here, is the exchange of energy. And energy is always going to be exchanging back and forth, because another thing I learned recently last year was that the soul needs that. The soul needs that exchange of energy. And to me, I think that's a part of that helped me unfold my understanding of what it means to be one with all. But even though there's energy that has to be exchanged, we still have power within ourselves. And let's say if we get exchanged something that's not good, or if we get bad energy, we can always move it out. We can always redirect it. And I think I'll wrap it up here at this point. But just looking back, communication. If you hear, if you're tired of hearing me say communication, communication, in some sense, good. Let this be a reminder, because it's always going to be a lifelong process, a practice, and there will be screw ups, but that's okay. That's part of the practice, And one thing I have to remind myself is that communication is not about, there isn't a destination, like I have to be perfect in my communication. Because, as I mentioned, I can do everything on my part as the communicator, the sender, but how my communications receive, it's outside of my realm of control, and it's outside of me. And that person is their whole on the universe, and they may respond negatively. Even if I've said something from a place of authenticity and I'm being positive, someone can receive that negative, but that doesn't speak to me, but that just shows where they're at. So because of that dynamic and relationship here, the 50-50 dynamic, that's why there may be screw ups, and it's okay. So as I remind myself, I want to remind you to give yourself grace, and it's okay. But if there's anything that bears repeating again, one of the things that really, my communication is just the assumption piece. Another, the assumption piece, right? The assumption of whatever it is based on my ideas and concepts, or what I think X, Y, and Z. To me, that's where it's important to take that step back. And I won't go too much into it, because I think, but at least I want to share that for you to have that awareness, where you might be assuming, where you won't communicate something, because where you assume something, thus you won't communicate something that would be important, right? We're not all mind readers. I believe in psychic abilities, but no one is like a mind reader and can perfectly figure out, I can hear everything you're saying, type of thing. It's a little bit more nuanced than that. And the other thing that would be a huge detriment to communication is fear. Fear. And it can show up in a lot of ways. I know for me, what can like mess up my communication is the fear of being seen for who I am. Sometimes I know for me growing up, I've gotten to this habit of like, uh, or maybe for a sense of like trying to belong, in some sense survival, but more so for belonging, to code switch. That's something I've done growing up, in high school, growing up in school, high school, college, and then middle school as well, elementary. But really think about my teenage years where I would code switch a lot and change up how I communicate. But sometimes if I'm not careful, I don't want to like kind of communicate with somebody with tight shoulders, if you will, or with just like a ring in my guts, or something in the pit of my stomach. I feel like when I'm truly communicating, it's like I'm communicating from that relaxed point of view. Something that I would consider is like if you ever find yourself communicating and you notice that you're nervous, it's a good it's a good opportunity to check, why am I feeling nervous? A good self check here. Because like I said, if I were to feel nervous, it's because for me, at times it can be there's a fear underneath it all. And so if you can recognize it for yourself, great, because that's, you know, I, what really can separate the good communicators from like the not so good communicators is just the good communicators are look at the things of what's holding them back, what's blocking the communication. Yes, there is some technical components of like how to share, how to talk. There's some aspect to it, the soft skills aspect to it, but there's another aspect to it of the what are the blockages that are suppressing my relating chakra to communicate with other people. How am I hindering myself from truly expressing? And these are some of the questions that I think that bears some like it bears acknowledgement. It warrants acknowledgement to look at it, because from there, that's how we can have more successful relating with people. No matter where you are, and communication is always going to be a thing, as long as you're here, as long as I'm here. So that's why I'm speaking to something that's a staple of the human experience, and I just hope at this point of the episode, I've empowered you to feel it in a way that's like, no matter where you are, you're doing fine. And you can always improve. You can always pivot. You can always do better. But not to get so bogged down like I know I do. Right? And I don't want to assume that this happens to you, but I'm just saying if it relates to you. I definitely am speaking to you in particular because, like I said, it's part of my own experience, my lived experience, my own challenges. So that's why I appreciate, that opportunity I had for the career day, doing something pretty big and just sharing with people, because I know it's something for me, it's important. The sharing is also, I would associate with the outflow chakra, which is what people would consider the third eye. My understanding of that chakra is the outflow chakra, where we can outflow through words and communication, but then also outflow through what we can do physically as well. And so, go forth and I wish you, more growth and more refinements, and wish you, I guess with communication, um, never stop. Never stop communicating. At least with yourself. Most importantly, because I forgot to mention that we communicate with people, with the universe, all the things around us, but we also are communicating with ourselves. And this is going back to this goes back to the foundation that we have a relationship with ourselves, and what we communicate with ourselves also plays a giant role, a big role that affects everything else. And in fact, it affects everything so much that needs to be the utmost priority in the avenue of or in, I guess, in the road of improvement, self improvement. You know, so you're doing great. At least I want to communicate that to you. It's important that you communicate to yourself that, and just being aware of that, those communications, the conversations that happen in your mind. Because I know I pick up some things that aren't constructive, aren't positive, in fact, are more critical. But the critical part, what gets me back into perspective, we're in a school. How I show up, planet Earth is a school. And as long as we're here, we're always practicing. Again, I'm gonna talk your ear out this episode. Practice, 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 practice. And I'm always gonna say that because I'm always coming back to that, no matter where I'm at in my life. And in light of everything that I've gone through in my life, I always come back to that. That is just from my own lived experience, what I've learned and what I've gathered so far. That's why I share it for you, my friend. If you get it, awesome. Thank you. If you don't, you'll get it one day. You'll get it. And maybe you might think about this particular episode, but oh, yeah, no, what Alvin said makes sense now. And in that case, you're welcome. All right, here we go. This has been another episode of Spiritual Engineered. I'm your host, Alvin Cepeda, signing out. And as always, take care, my dear friend.